It all started with a cardboard box left on her porch, half sunk in snow and wrapped in twine, so old it looked like it might crumble if touched too fast. No label, no postage, no handwriting, just a square of cracked tape holding the lid shut, and the faint smell of salt when she brought it inside. Eleanor Winslow had lived alone since Roger passed away 3 winters ago. The house creaked louder at night now, and the radio stayed on longer, just so silence didn't feel like a weight pressing down from the ceiling. She didn't get many visitors, and certainly no packages. Not anymore. She had the box on her kitchen table like it was something alive, not dangerous, exactly, but old. Familiar in a way that stirred something she couldn't name. She reached for a knife, paused, and pulled the twine instead. It slipped away with a reluctant sigh. Inside was a metal reel, a 16mm film canister marked only by a typed code on a yellowing label. Salt, H9FRAG, 13//class 3// eyes only. And beneath it, a single black and white photo. A woman, seated at a long table, hair pinned back tightly, eyes locked on something just outside the frame. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Because that face was her own. Or rather, the woman she had been 70 years ago. She hadn't seen that photograph in a lifetime, had never known it existed. But she remembered the room. She remembered the cold. She remembered the silence before the lights came on. The next day, Eleanor took the canister to her basement, where the film projector Roger had restored sat beneath a dust sheet. He had always loved old machines, said they deserved a second life, just like people did. She set up the reel with hands more steady than they should have been, considering the shaking in her chest. The film began with no sound, just the flicker of white frames, then gray. A hallway. Metal walls. A man walking, or maybe pacing, clipboard in hand. Then, abruptly, the camera turned. A sign. Vault entry, Salt House 9, clearance level red. She stepped closer. Salt House? She remembered that phrase from something deep in her bones. Not memory. Not quite. A feeling. Like static behind her ears. The film jumped again. The screen showed rows of narrow beds, children sitting upright on them, eyes wide, faces blank. Eleanor's throat tightened. She didn't know their names, but somehow she felt she had once heard their voices. Then came a single frame that froze, a flash of a red curtain, a door behind it marked with something smeared. Not blood. Something darker, duller. Ink maybe. She hit pause, but the projector hummed forward another few frames before stopping on its own. One final image burned into the film, a ledger page with her name. Typed. Dated. November 19th, 1952. Stamped. Withdrawn. She sat back slowly, heart thudding like a clock dropped from a shelf. What had she been withdrawn from? And who had sent this reel now, after all this time? That night she barely slept. The projector still whirred in her mind like it hadn't stopped at all. When morning came, she found herself downstairs again, standing in front of the paused image like it might speak if stared at long enough. It didn't. But something else did, or rather, someone. Because when she opened her front door just before noon, there was a man standing on her porch. Middle-aged, in a wool coat, holding his hat in both hands. He looked like he had been waiting for a long time. "I'm sorry to come like this," he said, his voice low and careful. "But if you're Eleanor Winslow, then I think you knew my mother." She frowned. "I don't believe I." But then he pulled something from his coat, a second film reel, identical in every way to hers. And tucked beside it was a page. Faded, brittle, and marked with the same words. Salt House 9. Fragment 14. And what he said next made her knees buckle slightly. "I think you were there when she disappeared." He said her name was Margaret Ellison. Disappeared in the fall of 1952, last seen near Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. She was 19. Worked in a clerical unit, nothing sensitive, officially. But there were rumors about that fall, about buses that left late at night and never came back, about women reassigned without explanation, about families who stopped getting letters. Eleanor stood in her hallway gripping the second reel, still chilled from the man's hand. Margaret. The name didn't spark a clear memory, just a tremor. Like something behind a locked door, just out of reach. She didn't remember a Margaret, but she remembered voices in the dark, echoing through cold stone walls, soft songs hummed in fear. The man introduced himself as Daniel, Margaret's son. He was in his 50s now, a schoolteacher, quiet and sharp-eyed, like someone who'd learned to live among ghosts. He'd only learned of Salt House by accident, through a mislabeled shipping manifest found in his grandfather's war records. It listed a personal film container, non-returnable, marked for vault salt, H9. His mother's name was typed beside it. No explanation. Eleanor hesitated. Why come to me? Because yours is the only other name I found connected to that vault, he said. You're listed on fragment 13. My mother is on 14. And I think someone wanted us to find each other. He pulled a second envelope from his coat. In it, a map. A crude one. Scanned from microfilm, marked in red pencil with 3 letters, S, H, 9. And beneath it, access tunnel sealed. Secondary breach viable. Hutchinson Mine. West Shaft. Her mouth went dry. That place was shut down decades ago. He nodded. Officially. But I called a friend who works in the Geological Records office. That West Tunnel was reinforced in 1977. They said it was for film integrity. He paused. What kind of film needs a concrete ceiling and no air? The next morning, Eleanor stood at her attic window, watching the snow fall across her backyard. In the corner sat her old suitcase, the leather cracking at the edges. She hadn't traveled in years. Not since Roger. Not since her knees began to argue with her will. But now there was something pulling her, not just the mystery of Margaret, but the pieces of herself buried with that sealed vault. She called Daniel. Told him she'd go. They'd meet in Kansas, in a town called Haven, a small grid of buildings surrounded by wheat and wind. From there, it was 20 miles to Hutchinson Mine, in the sealed western shaft. Before leaving, she made one more discovery. In a drawer Roger had kept locked, a drawer she'd never dared to open, she found a folder marked only with a code. H9. Red, level. Inside were dozens of thin photographic slides. Most were blank, degraded. But a few showed corridors. Hallways lined with flickering bulbs. And one with a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, seated in front of a screen. The child wore headphones. Eyes open. Mouth closed. And on the screen, Eleanor's face. She sat down hard, knees trembling. That wasn't just a connection. That was a record. Someone, maybe Roger, had known all along. Had seen things. Had saved them. And if those images came from Salt House 9, then he had been there, too. 3 days later, they stood at the edge of the old access road, wind dragging dust across their boots. The mine entrance had long been sealed with concrete and steel. But the secondary breach, marked faintly on Daniel's copy of the map, lay behind a thicket of scrub oak and collapsed fencing. It took 2 hours to find the opening, a rusted maintenance hatch sunk into the earth, half covered by roots. The padlock was missing, as if someone had left it open, just for them. They descended slowly, Daniel first, Eleanor behind him, gripping the cold steel rungs one by one. The shaft dropped 40 feet into silence. Then the walls widened into a chamber of cut salt, crystalline and strange, lit only by their lanterns. Eleanor turned slowly in place. There was writing etched faintly along the upper edge of the far wall. Vault H9, access limited, red clearance required. And below it, a final, smaller line. Established, March 18, 1945. Sealed, October 3, 1952. She pressed her hand to the wall, fingers trembling. That was the week she'd been told she was being transferred. But no one had ever said where to. Daniel exhaled sharply. There's more down here. He had walked ahead, shining his lantern down a narrow corridor. On the right wall, a steel door, barely open. Inside, rows of stacked reels, rusted shelves, and a table holding a black ledger. He picked it up gently, flipped to a page. His hand went still. Eleanor, he said, voice tight. There's a note. Dated 2 days after your name was stamped, withdrawn. He swallowed. It says, Subject 14 transitioned. Fragment incomplete. Do not reopen without directive. She stepped forward, heart pounding. And what's on the next page? He turned it. And that's when they saw it. The first entry stamped in red ink. Project Memory Mirror. Status, unresolved. Subject still active. Daniel stood frozen with the ledger still open in his hands, while Eleanor stared at the words stamped so clearly on the brittle paper. Subject still active. 3 simple words, but they hit her like a gust of cold wind from a door she thought had been locked forever. The phrase Project Memory Mirror scratched at the walls of her mind, like fingernails against paint. She didn't remember hearing those exact words before, but her body did. Her breath hitched, her chest tightened, and behind her eyes, something stirred. A flash, a long corridor of salt white walls, a mirror at the end. But it wasn't reflecting her. It was waiting. Daniel flipped the page. The next section was a list, Names, dates, notes. Some were blacked out. Some were marked deceased. Then, near the bottom, was another name. Margaret Ellison, fragment 14, status, active, unaccounted. And beneath it, scribbled in pen by a different hand. Last seen within mirror wing. No extraction possible. Eleanor took a step back. Mirror wing. She didn't know what it meant yet, but it was real, and Margaret had entered it and never come out. They left the ledger where they found it and moved deeper into the corridor. The air grew colder as they walked, though the salt around them was dry and still. The corridor sloped downward, and soon they came upon a heavy steel door, different from the others. This one had a viewing slot and 4 bolts welded shut. Daniel brushed away dust from a nearby sign. It read, "Mirror wing. Level R access only. Isolation required." Someone had scratched words beneath it, barely visible. "Do not watch her watching." Eleanor's hand trembled as she turned her lantern toward the viewing slot. Just beyond the glass, the room was dark. But in the faint reflection of her own face in the glass, she thought she saw movement, not in the room, but behind her reflection. Something else watching from inside the mirror. She blinked and stepped back. "That's not just glass." Daniel nodded slowly. "One-way film. It's embedded." He looked at her. This wasn't just a storage room. This was experimental. He rummaged through a nearby shelf and found a film canister, nearly identical to the ones they'd received, but labeled differently. Mirror record // 10. 22. 52 / session 4. The canister rattled when he shook it, film still inside. They had a small hand-cranked viewer in their pack. Daniel had brought it in case they found anything analog. They fed the film in carefully and turned the crank. At first, static, then a dim corridor. A woman's face turned to the camera, young, eyes wide, silent. Margaret. She was seated in front of a screen. On it, images flickered rapidly. Faces, text, symbols, maps. Then a moment of stillness. The screen displayed only a single word in black font on white. "Remember." And Margaret began to speak. But her words weren't her own. It was as if she was reciting, or channeling, someone else. Her voice was deeper, slower. She spoke names that Eleanor recognized. Soldiers, officers, some long since dead. She gave dates and orders. She listed protocols. Then her voice shifted again. She began describing a girl. A girl who had been brought into the wing, sedated, recorded. A girl who had been mirrored. Eleanor's pulse raced. That girl, it was her. Margaret was describing her. The film ended mid-sentence. Just a blank frame. They sat in silence, lantern light flickering against the salt walls. What were they doing here? Daniel finally asked. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could feel something assembling in her memory, piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle from another life. But the final shape wasn't clear. "I don't know," she said slowly. "But I think they wanted to record more than memories. I think they wanted to store people, reflections of them, echoes." Daniel whispered, "Memory mirror." She nodded. Then she turned her face back to the glass and the steel door. And behind her reflection, just for a second, she saw Margaret, standing still, watching her. But Margaret wasn't older. She hadn't aged. And her lips moved in perfect silence, forming a single word. "Run." There was no sound, just the deep, dry click of metal on metal as the bolts inside the steel door began to shift. Daniel backed away instinctively, his hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "I didn't touch it," he whispered. "I know," she said, her eyes locked on the viewing slot. "But someone did." The door didn't swing open all at once. It slid a few inches, then stuck, groaning like something waking up after too many decades of sleep. Dust fell from its edges, and air rushed outward, sharp, cold, dry as bone. But beneath it came something stranger. A scent. Old salt and plastic. But also something more human, like faded perfume and overheated projector film. Daniel pulled out a folding pry bar and worked the opening wider. As the door creaked open, their lantern swept across a room untouched by time. It was circular, about 20 feet across, lined with mirrors. Not silvered glass, but metallic panels, curved and polished, each one faintly humming with static. In the center, a single metal chair bolted to the floor, with leather restraints and a thick headpiece hanging from the ceiling like a crown. Eleanor stepped inside. Her breath fogged the cold air. She moved slowly, cautiously, like entering a chapel no one had prayed in for 70 years. On the floor near the chair lay a clipboard, yellowed with time. She picked it up. Project Memory Mirror, Test 014. Subject, Ellison, M. Observer notes. Subject displayed 8 minutes of echo overlap. Primary loop includes unknown content. Possible contamination. Action taken. Isolation protocol initiated. No further sessions scheduled. Status, sealed. Non-recoverable. Daniel stared at the mirrored panels. His reflection shifted oddly, lagging by a fraction of a second. Something's wrong with them, he said. They're not reflecting light. They're mimicking it. Eleanor touched one panel lightly. It was cold and vibrated softly beneath her fingers, like it was alive. And in its depths, for just a moment, she saw herself as a child, clutching a doll, looking up at a ceiling light that wasn't there. Then it was gone. She turned to Daniel. I think these panels record. Not just images, but pieces. Fragments of people. Daniel looked around. And the subjects were stored here? Or mirrored, she said softly. Copied. Echoed. Maybe to preserve memories, maybe to study them. But not all the echoes faded. Some of them stayed. They backed out of the mirror wing and sealed the door behind them. Neither said what they both felt, that it had opened too easily, like something had been waiting. Or watching. Back in the hallway, they took the opposite path, deeper into the vault. The air changed subtly, warmer now, more metallic. And then, without warning, the corridor opened into a long archive room filled with film canisters, tape reels, and rows of shelving labeled with red-coded numbers. Eleanor ran her fingers along a shelf marked M-range/restricted. She pulled one canister at random. It was labeled. Recording. Object 13. Fragment 1. Date. September 9th, 1952. Status. Failed recording. Do not duplicate. Daniel looked at her sharply. Object 13? She nodded slowly. Trigger designation. I've seen it before. She scanned the other labels. Object 13. Fragment 2. Fragment 3. Fragment 4. Sealed. Fragment 5. Warning. Feedback loop detected. She found the last one in the set, Fragment 7. It had no date. Just a note. Returned by subject. Do not store. But it was stored. It had been kept. And next to it, a sealed envelope, never opened. Her name on the front, in Roger's handwriting. She stared at it for a long time before breaking the seal. Inside was a single photograph, not of her, not of Daniel's mother, but of the two of them together. In uniforms. Seated at that long metal table. It was dated October 1st, 1952, 2 days before Salt House was shut down. And written on the back, in pen. They didn't erase everything. Not from us. Her knees gave out, and she sat heavily on the cold floor. She was there. They both had been there. They had known each other once. Daniel knelt beside her. We were connected before we ever met. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. But why don't I remember? And that's when the lights in the vault flickered. Once. Twice. And then the projector behind them turned on by itself. The hum of the ancient projector filled the room like the low drone of a distant engine, trembling through the salt-packed walls with unnatural precision. Eleanor and Daniel turned slowly, their lantern light catching on the dust motes drifting through the archive air like flecks of memory. The screen at the far end of the vault glowed faintly. A flicker. A pulse. Then, motion. There was no one at the controls. No one had touched the machine. Yet it was running not from a switch, but from a queue buried deep in the system, waiting for someone to arrive, someone who matched a pattern long thought erased. The film opened on a room not unlike the one they stood in now. The camera was fixed, unmoving. At the center sat two women in military uniforms. One was Margaret. The other was Eleanor. Younger, rigid, staring straight ahead. Neither woman looked at the other. They weren't speaking, but someone, off-screen, was. A man's voice, distorted by time and magnetic decay, buzzed into the room. Initiate observation 13. Fragment convergence test. Subjects 0 and 4. Begin retrieval loop. Daniel sucked in a breath. They were testing you. The screen jumped. New angle. The two women were still seated, but now their eyes were closed. Overhead, a mirror disc descended, not a projector, but a scanner. It lit their faces with pulses of white, then red, then black. And then, one after another, the women began to speak. But not in their own voices. Eleanor, or rather, her younger self, listed towns, names, numbers, like code. Margaret recited poetry. Not English. Something older. Daniel leaned forward, recognizing a few words as Latin. But then she switched into something else. Russian. Then German. Each fragment lasted only seconds, like skipping through records in someone else's library of thought. Repeat loop. Observe deviations, the voice said. What if they're remembering the wrong things? Came another voice, female, younger, unsure. What if they're building something new? Silence. Then we seal the vault. And we pray the mirrors don't learn how to speak on their own. The reel spun down with a final slow groan. Then the screen went black. Daniel sat down on a crate, stunned. This wasn't just about memory, it was synthesis. Eleanor's voice trembled. They weren't just recording echoes. They were reassembling people, fragment by fragment, through others, using exposure to trigger mutual memory recall. Project Memory Mirror wasn't a vault. It was a reactor. Daniel whispered, and we were the fuel. A silence settled over them, heavy, humming. Then they both turned, almost at once, toward the archive's far wall. The light had changed. A soft, flickering blue glow leaked from a doorway they hadn't seen before. No label. No doorframe. Just a black slit in the salt, now glowing like a wound. Without speaking, they moved toward it. Inside, a smaller room, empty except for a chair, a speaker, and a single 16mm reel already loaded in the projector. No canister. No label. It began playing the moment they stepped through the threshold. This time there were no voices. Just silence. And then, images of them. Not from the past. Not from the vault. From 3 days ago. Eleanor boarding the bus to Kansas. Daniel leaving his classroom. Her opening the envelope. Him standing on her porch. Recorded from angles that could not have existed. From places where no camera had been. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. They've been watching. Daniel gritted his teeth. No, not just watching. Predicting. This was already recorded. Before we came. The film ended abruptly, but not on darkness. The final frame was a door, marked in red ink. Object 13, final storage. Authorized entry, none. Location, Central Core. Eleanor looked at Daniel. It's here. He nodded. And we have to find it. But just as they turned to leave the chamber, every projector in the archive turned on at once. And every screen showed Margaret's face. But in each one, she was older. Aged as if she'd never been sealed. She looked directly into the lens, as if seeing them now. And she spoke one sentence, repeated across all the recordings in unison. Don't let them finish building me. There was no map. No signage. No markers on the walls. But Eleanor knew where to go. She didn't remember how. She didn't need to. Some part of her had already been there, or left something behind that still remembered her. Daniel followed close, lantern in one hand, the envelope from Roger in the other. The air shifted with every corridor, warmer now, as if the salt wasn't just stone but breathing, like lungs exhaling 70 years of forgotten names. They reached the core wing, deeper than they should have gone. The walls here were smoother, darker. The salt more compressed, more engineered. At the end of a long hallway stood a door unlike the rest. No rust. No bolts. Just black steel with a small brass plaque. Object 13. Final storage. Authorized entry. None. And underneath, barely visible in the dim light. Last accessed, October 3rd, 1952. Daniel brushed his fingers over the plaque. That's the day Salt House was sealed. Eleanor nodded. And the last time anyone saw Margaret. The door had no handle, only a central lock pad, analog, cracked. Eleanor reached out, hesitated, then pressed her fingers flat against the surface. The panel blinked red, then flickered green. The door slid open on its own. The room inside was round. Stone walls laced with copper veins and paneling, dimly lit by strips of faded industrial lights. And in the center was a mirror. 10 feet tall, oval, freestanding, its surface not reflective but liquid, like mercury frozen mid-motion. Wires connected it to a series of film reels spinning slowly in steel frames around the room. Each reel played nothing, just white frames, silent and endless. On a table nearby was a file. Handwritten. Yellowed. The cover read, Project M13, Object-Based Synthesis. Memo. For eyes only. Director Stratton. Subject. Fragment storage success, mirror vessel stabilized. All 7 fragments have taken root. Visual echoes stable. Vocal mimicry observed. Memory feedback increasing. The vessel is speaking in combinations not yet taught. Fragment 4's integration with Ellison confirms external memory absorption. Recommend immediate decommission. Eleanor whispered, they weren't trying to remember the past. Daniel finished. They were trying to create something new. Suddenly, the mirror's surface pulsed. Once. Then again. And Margaret's face emerged. But not just one version. Her image fractured, multiplied, echoing across the liquid surface, young and old, smiling and terrified, whispering and screaming. Voices layered on voices, crying out from behind the glass. Then, one voice pushed through clear, precise. It was Eleanor's own. I didn't leave her. I stayed. I stayed until the lights went out. Daniel turned to her. You said you didn't remember that day. I didn't, she breathed. But she does. The mirror rippled again. A single word floated across the surface, written in backward letters. Release. Daniel looked at her. What happens if we say yes? Eleanor stared at the mirror. We find out who Margaret became, and whether anything human is still inside. The lights around the reels began to spin faster. The reels clicked. One by one, they began reversing, rewinding time. And then, in the mirror, a doorway appeared. It was the room from Fragment 14. But now it was open. Waiting. I think we go in, Eleanor said. Together. Daniel nodded, trembling. They stepped forward. The mirror's surface shimmered and opened. And the instant they passed through, everything changed. They were not underground anymore. They stood in a sunlit room, filled with flickering images, voices, pieces of half-remembered lives. Children laughing. Soldiers saluting. Women writing. Men fading. At the center of it all, Margaret. But she was no longer just Margaret. She was a mosaic of memory. A living archive. And she was waiting for them. I knew you'd come, she said, her voice an echo of dozens, yet still unmistakably hers. They left us here, all of us. But they didn't finish the story. Eleanor stepped forward. Then let's finish it. Eleanor turned. Someone was standing in the doorway behind them, half-shadowed, unmoving. Not Daniel. Not Margaret. A man in a faded government-issue coat, face lined with age and silence. His badge was cracked, but the lettering still legible. Director Stratton. You were never supposed to get this far, he said quietly. The mirror wasn't meant for the public. It was meant to contain anomalies, not release them. Daniel stepped forward. You sealed them in here. You left people behind, memories, minds, like they were garbage. They volunteered, Stratton said coldly. Or they were. Unstable. It was the Cold War. Memory was a weapon. Salt House wasn't a prison. It was a firewall. Eleanor's voice was steady. You tried to erase us. And it didn't work. Stratton looked at Margaret, or what Margaret had become, a living archive. Hundreds of voices woven into one consciousness, flickering like light through old celluloid. She's not human anymore, he said. She's dangerous. I'm not dangerous, Margaret said softly. I'm remembered. The mirror's room pulsed, not violently, but like a heartbeat. Images flickered across the walls again. Eleanor as a young woman, Daniel's mother in uniform, Roger pulling film from a reel, sealing the door behind him. They saw everything. And understood. Salt House was a mirror, yes, but also a question. What if memories, once captured, learned how to organize themselves? What if fragments didn't fade, but found each other? Margaret stepped closer. There's a choice now, she said. You can shut the vault. Forget again. Or let the story finish. Let me out. Stratton raised a small device, a failsafe. One click, and the entire structure would seal again, permanently this time. No return. He looked at Eleanor. Your memory was the key. But that door swings both ways. Are you ready to remember what you did to stay alive? Eleanor's breath caught. She did remember. She remembered the day Salt House was evacuated. The alarms. The panicked voices. And she remembered, leaving Margaret behind. Locked in the mirror room. Not out of cruelty, but obedience. Orders. But still, she had left her. I am, Eleanor whispered. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the failsafe, not to trigger it, but to disable it. Stratton's eyes widened. You don't know what you're releasing. No, Eleanor said. I know exactly what we're releasing. We're releasing the truth. With a final breath, she turned to Margaret. Come with us. The mirror dissolved. Not shattered, but unfolded, like mist clearing from a mountain. Margaret stepped through, whole, real, impossibly alive. Behind her, the room faded. The Salt House files collapsed into light. 1 month later, a small exhibit opened in a library outside Kansas City. No grand announcements. No headlines. Just an archive labeled Object 13, Civil Memory Records. 1944 to 1952, recovered testimonies from lost women of Salt House. The public believed it was fiction, a Cold War narrative project. But tucked in the back, behind a pane of glass, sat 7 reels of film. Labeled not with numbers, but names. Ellison, Griggs, Morano, Reyes, Chen, Watley, Ellington. The stories they told were strange, fragmented, but human and real. Margaret visited sometimes, walking the halls in silence. She was aging now. Naturally. Whatever Salthouse had built, it was no longer inside her. She had been given back her time. Daniel returned to teaching. And Eleanor. She finally opened Roger's last journal. Inside, he had written just one sentence. You didn't forget her. You just weren't ready to remember. And beneath it, tucked inside the binding, a key to a locker in a small Denver bus station. When she opened it, there was a single item inside. A film reel labeled, Eleanor. Final fragment. Play only when you're ready. She hasn't played it. Not yet. Some mirrors don't need light to reflect. Some just need time.